Okay, for this lecture, we're going to talk, we're still talking about post-war culture in the 1950s, and we're going to look at certain themes. Last lecture, we talked about the post-war economic boom, the rise of consumerism, wealth, and prosperity. And today we're going to revisit those topics, but also hit on certain developments like suburbs and the growth of suburban culture, and then also the themes of conformity and rebellion. I think when you look at the 1950s, whether you want to talk about suburbs and suburban culture like we are today, or if you wanted to talk about the Cold War and the Red Scare, or even like American literature and authors and art and writers, you'll see these themes of a pressure to conform, but also an impulse to rebel. So we'll talk about this some today. For this lecture, since this is primarily for the students at home, I want you to kind of see some of the resources that we'll be working through in class. You'll go into your post-war unit. And then scroll down on the links. Here are some of the things that we're going to look at today. When we go to lecture, I'm going to use this link first, 1950s Suburbs, Conformity, and Rebellion Notes. But I won't show these to you in the lecture, but I definitely want you to watch this Little Boxes music video. And then also this little excerpt that says criticizing conformity. So we may come back to those at the end, but those are the things that we're going to be using in class today. These notes, this video, and this primary source. As far as these notes, in class, we'll be kind of filling these out together and discussing. I'm not going to read you every word. You can go and click on this link or follow along. But it says 1950 society reflects several major themes. And the first theme is one that we've talked about last week. The first theme is the spread of affluence and the growth of consumerism. Suburbs and TV play a big part of this, the baby boom. What we see in the 1950s is a growing middle class, an increase in home ownership, a rise of accessibility to consumer goods, whether it be cars and appliances, entertainment, or even fast food. Of course, McDonald's gets its start in the 1950s. And then the spread of affluence also leads to changes. Opportunities for women, people move south and west to the Sun Belt, more service-oriented jobs. So this is stuff that we've kind of covered over the past few days, and I just wanted to get it out there for you in notes. Now, one of the things we'll do in class today is we're going to read some stuff right at the beginning, and I'm going to scroll down. Here is a description of some of the early suburban development. This idea of a Levittown. We saw this in a video last week. The primary feature of this early Levittown house was its low cost, under $8,000 to purchase. You know, in 2021, a modest home might be $100,000 to $125,000. You might be able to find some fixer-uppers cheaper than that, but you can just see how cheap it was to buy, albeit a small but ready-made suburban home in the 1950s. The first one designed by Levitt and Sons for $8,000. And the GIs, the veterans, and the GI Bill allowed people to do that with a lot of times zero down payment and start a new family. This secondary source reading is from a book called Grand Expectations, and it talks a little bit about maybe the unintended consequences of suburban growth. We think that new suburbia is going to be like this idyllic kind of utopia of a society, but it says no one has grown up in it. It has no traditions. we really don't know what effect it will ultimately have on children. We can only conjecture. This is what people were saying when the suburbs first started in the 50s. And this is going to bring us back to our notes. What we didn't realize, or what maybe people didn't realize, is that when we went into this new suburban culture, these themes of a pressure to conform, or an impulse or a sense to rebel, or maybe the unintended consequences of suburban growth. Suburbs and television led to the standardization of American life. In class, we'll reference examples of sameness, same clothes, same interest in TV shows, same advertisements, maybe sometimes the same ideal image of what it means to be successful. You know, maybe in the past, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, America had this dream of hard work, work ethic, and making something of yourself, whatever it may be, a very inner driven idea of success. However, now in this suburban culture, the American dream is being redefined. And it's like, well, now to be successful, you have to go to high school, go to college, get a job, get married, have 2 kids, have a white picket fence, and it's very standardized. And the diversity of the American dream could be being lost. Of course, there is a racial component to this. There is what's called de facto segregation, or white flight. A lot of times when you look at 1950s suburban culture, it is going to be very homogenous in terms of race. White people had access to home loans and to the best networking connections to get these new homes. And we see a conformity, not just in terms of maybe the ideal of the American dream, but also in the sense of race, or you could even go into things like religion. Usually in these suburban communities, there's very much a sense of sameness, whether it be race or taste in cars or religions or anything. Over time, that becomes very dull. There's a lack of a sense of adventure, and as a result of the growth of suburbs and the pressure to conform, we'll see a growing sense to rebel. This is why perhaps in the 1950s there became such an interest in rock and roll music. This first generation of the baby boom, the people who were born in, say, 1945, 46, 47, they're growing up and entering their teen years in the late 50s and early 60s. And this is going to be the heyday of rock and roll. Of course, rock and roll has its roots in African American music, and many of the best performers were Black. Tomorrow, we'll probably watch a video of Elvis. Certainly, by the time you get to the 60s, I'm sure people have heard of the Beatles, but some of your front runners or forerunners of the rock and roll movement were people like Chuck Berry and Little Richard. And rock and roll music in itself has its roots in African American culture, jazz, syncopated rhythm, and things like that. These baby boomers who are very much looking to rebel through music, by the time you get to the 1960s and 70s, they're going to be your hippies, who are usually part of the anti-war movement in terms of Vietnam, and participating in festivals and things like Woodstock. The impulse to rebel is not just in music, though. It was also in literature and other social groups. In literature, much like rock and roll had its development, in literature, there was a movement known as the Beat movement, or the Beatnik movement. These were individualists. They emphasized individuality, free thinking, and a sense of rebellion. These are people like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. They kind of said, look, you don't have to be just what everybody else expects you to be. You can think outside the box. You can march to your own drummer. In some senses, this is going to lead to the free spirits of the 60s. This is going to be some of the the ideas behind the counterculture and hippie movement. This certainly might lead to experimentation with recreational drugs in the 1960s. But Jack Kerouac famously wrote a book called On the Road, where it was a journey of self-discovery and inner reflection. So you definitely want to know about, just like rock and roll exhibits an impulse to rebel, so does the beat movement in literature. As far as social groups, women and African Americans will also push back against conformity and social norms. We watched I Love Lucy earlier in the week. We talked about those gender roles, those negative stereotypes, and Betty Friedan, in her book, The Feminine Mystique, began to push back and question some of the social norms that kind of put women in a particular box related to femininity and also to domestic work and being a housewife. She called it the feminine mystique, and she really kickstarts the modern feminist movement, which we'll talk about more in the 60s and 70s. And then African Americans, too, are going to rebel. And we'll talk about this in our civil rights unit. But the modern civil rights movement is essentially a pushback against the pressure to conform. I don't want you to miss that the modern civil rights movement is a form of rebellion. It was a acting out and saying segregation and the social norms and the expectations on people of color from essentially a white majority were not okay. And certainly the civil rights movement reflects that impulse to rebel. Okay, these are the notes for 1950s culture: suburbs, affluence, pressure to conform, and rebel. This is what we'll be talking about in class. I hope it makes sense. Just again, I strongly encourage you to go back and watch this music video, Little Boxes. It was a song written in the early 60s that very much questioned the value of the suburbs and suburban culture. This is a remake by a more modern band called Walk Off the Earth. It's a very creative video, and I think you'll like it. And then also, don't forget to check out this, Criticizing Conformity. This is by a social critic of the time, David Reisman, and he questions, he talks about essentially how the suburbs were said to energize development, but he also said that suburbs were essentially like a fraternity house at a small college in which like-mindedness reverberates upon itself. Kind of says, much like social media today, he said the suburbs put us into an echo chamber where all we see and hear is our own voice and voices of people like us. We lack diversity. We lack this individualistic inner direction, and we are other directed. So definitely check this out. It's an interesting, a few interesting thoughts. Okay, that's it for today. Suburbs, conformity, rebellion. Be ready for a discussion board tomorrow. And that's it. Thanks for watching.